Welcome. Good morning, good day, good evening to all of you. Welcome to this podcast of Leading in Times of COVID-19. And this is the second part in our podcast series where we dive into the field of how to navigate uncertainty and especially how to lead in times of crisis with creativity and with passion. So my name is Lars Südmann. I will guide you through this podcast. I will share a couple of ideas for this. Before we dive into this one, some quick thoughts and some quick recommendations. Make the most of the podcast. We will be sharing a couple of polls, so please participate in those. We will share a couple of questions and so on. If you have questions, type it in there. Later on, we'll send you as well the presentation as a download. Try to view it in full screen and so on, and then you can really get the most out of this. It is also, you can earn professional credits with this podcast here, with this webcast, if you stay on the line, so to speak. And during the webcast, there will be sometimes like some little pods appearing where you can enter your name for the accreditation. So, how to navigate uncertainty with leadership, creativity, and clarity. That is our topic here. Before I dive into the theme and into the key content, I wanted to quickly ask you, also to get a bit of a feeling where, well, like 60, 80 people here on the call, I would just open and see here from where you're calling in, from which continent in the world you're calling in at the moment, so that we have a feeling for that. Okay, results are coming in. Okay. I will end the poll right now, and you'll see it here. The vast majority from North America calling in. So good morning to all of you. And also we have from Europe and Asia some participation as well. Now, I do assume you're all affected at the moment, of course, by this worldwide pandemic that we are all dealing with, that we're all affected across the world at the moment. And this is part 2 in our leadership series. I just wanted to get also a lot of other feeling here. If you have participated in our previous session, which was on remote leadership, just there to understand, again, this is a fully standalone session as well, but just to get a little feeling of this. Okay, results are coming in here. Very interesting. Okay. Fantastic. I will broadcast the results to you. It's almost 50-50 that we see here. Some of you have half of you have attended, the others haven't attended. So we'll share maybe some of my background as well with you, but again, these are standalone sessions. It is just for my overview. So who am I? Well, my name is Lars Südmann. I'm an advisor, I'm a keynote speaker. And with the conference board, I'm a council director for 2 councils. One is focused on strategy and transformation, and the other is focused on CFOs. And also speaking of CFOs, I've been a strategy leader, but I've also been the CFO of Procter & Gamble of Belgium. And I still very, very much remember this role, not only because it was a great role and it was a great company to work for, but also because it was a very special date that I took on my onboarding. Because I very much remember my onboarding for the day. It began on September the 15th of 2008. And if some of you remember and go back to the books, it was actually quite interesting onboarding. Look at that. I hope you stayed on the line. I am sorry for that. I got temporarily disconnected. Probably when I shared this piece of Lehman here, probably there was a disconnection already happening. So I took the job. Just apologies again for those of you who were waiting there. I took this job at that time just to restart the webcast here, and learned quite a lot about crisis leadership during that time. And in the session here today, that our remaining session, I want to dive into that field a little bit, but especially I learned about one thing. I will open up just a second. Okay. Yeah, and you can see me again, hopefully as well. Again, welcome back. Something again happened here. Apologies for that. So one thing is that I learned back during that time is, and that is best summarized by the words of Peter Drucker. he mentioned one thing: only 3 things happen naturally in organizations. And back then in 2008, we could really see that. And I could see that leading an organization also through the crisis. And that is friction, confusion, and underperformance. That happens just like that. You don't have to do anything for it. But everything else requires leadership. Everything else requires leadership. And today I want to share with you from 4 different angles, a couple of strategies around this. I've been lecturer and speaker right now. I've been researching crisis leadership a lot, board advisor with the council board. I've been a crisis leader myself, and there's always a 4th angle, and that is I've been on the receiving end of crisis leadership as well. And as crisis leaders, from time to time, it's important to look at this as well. When we talk about crisis leadership, and now also if you look at your social media feeds, in case you're looking at social media, you can see this superhero model of leaderships. Oh, what leaders should be doing. But I don't buy that much into the superhero model of leadership. I want you to spend 30 seconds to think about the best crisis leader you've ever worked with or for. Think about the best crisis leader you've ever worked with or for. What did he or she do? And what is he or she maybe doing at the moment? And that should be a real person. Not something like Master Yoda or something like this. A real person at the moment. What is he or she doing? What are the actions? And the answers will probably vary quite a lot in between all of you, but I'm reasonably sure, having asked this across the globe, this question, that typically what doesn't come to mind is like, wow, the way he or she are running around like headless chicken, not knowing what to do, that is so inspiring. Probably that doesn't happen anymore. Probably also what doesn't come to mind is, wow, the way he's yelling at me every morning, that is fantastic. I love that. That is so great. But probably there's something else that comes to mind. And what I want to explore here today are what are some of the answers that I've seen in my research and my work as well on great crisis leadership. And what I want to do is to share with you a couple of tools for crisis leadership and really explore these together. Before we go into these tools, and by the way, this webcast doesn't end after the end of the webcast. We can also continue the conversation afterwards. But what I would love to understand is one thing at the moment from all of us here. How much is your organization, your company, in crisis mode at the moment? Actually, and that will be interesting because I work with companies all across the industry, and it's very, very different actually for some of them. And we will see that also here as well on the attendance. Basically, because for some, as we all know from the news, there's extremely high crisis mode. For some, actually, there is a very, very much a boom of business going on at the moment and no crisis mode whatsoever. So the results have came in and we'll broadcast them to you, and we see as well this spread over here. Some of you very high crisis mode, some high, 38%, the majority somewhat crisis mode, and then some also a bit of crisis mode and so on. And we see that across the globe at the moment as well. That depending on where you are, it's a different level of crisis mode that we're in. Now, I want, of course, to talk generally because what is not yet might come. So I think like having the toolbox for crisis leadership are quite important. So what I want to share with you is 10 strategies for crisis leadership. I've gathered them around 4 parts of crisis leadership, but 10 quick strategies for crisis leadership. And I want to start with the first part, which is the fundamentals. And the fundamental first strategy for crisis leadership for me is here. What is the reality look like? And that great leaders, in my view, face reality. They do face and accept the reality that there is. They don't put something away and say like, oh no, that doesn't exist, that doesn't concern it. Because if you start doing that, if a new reality happens, if a new crisis kicks in, very often what you see with, I would say, rather not so good crisis leadership, it builds up like these Jenga towers that some of you might have played or might have played with your family and kids. And at some stage, when you build up your thought experiment and say like, okay, no, there's one step after the other and so on, you really build up your concept like, no, it's not a crisis, it's not a crisis. That might be for the company or also maybe talking about the general world at the moment here. And at one stage, somebody draws out this one and then the whole set of beliefs actually falls apart. I think a key part of crisis leadership is facing reality and accepting reality very fast at the beginning. Somebody once said, you can choose to ignore reality. That's okay. but you cannot choose to ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And that is what I think great Christ leaders do. As hard as it is, as painful as it is, be it with the global pandemic in terms of COVID-19, but also maybe some of the repercussions that we will see, all will see across, and some of you across industries will see, we will feel this. And it's great crisis leaders start intending those as fast as possible. Then number 2, identify your circle of influence. Identify your circle of influence. And what do I mean by that? When we look across in discussions, lots of you might be in temporary working from home at the moment, or of course being separated, not going to work, not going to offices at the moment. But if you see, especially on social media, lots of people, there's lots of experts on the global crisis and so on at the moment as well. And of course it's great and it's important to think through. But when it comes to your circle of influence, what I challenge every leader to do is to really reflect on what is the circle that you can influence? What are the one things where you have actions that you can take right now? What are the things that are in your circle of influence that you and yourself, for your team, for your area, can actually influence and can change and can adapt? Because many, many times people go like outside, or like, oh, these experts and so on, or here, or they discuss like lots of things and spend lots of energy on this. And it's good, of course, to have the overthinking. But when it comes to crisis leadership, what the best crisis leader do, they identify what is in our circle of influence right now. And there's another concept that I use with this one, which is called the window of opportunity. What can I do right now that can help us get out of this crisis? We might discuss, we might disagree with a couple of measures, but it is what it is at the moment, facing reality, like what can we do right now? Where can we look at cash? Where can we look at some of the measures? What is still open and where might some window be closing? And what I've seen the greatest crisis leader then do is really look at what I would call a dual strategy. Of course, a lot of the organizations, and for those of you who answered very high crisis mode, it will really be, well, maybe even short-term survival, really looking at where is the cash, how can we sustain the next couple of weeks? And that is important to really identify what are the measures that we can do right now and that we have to do right now, facing that reality that we do. But one of the things, and whenever I explore that, and at the moment with leaders, what we should never forget and not forget is to also at the same time see like, where that we don't forget also the longer term. What is the new reality looking at? And if we have the time to focus on that, can we actually already step more and more steps towards long-term actions as well? What are the things that we can do right now as well to maybe in this new reality that we accept, get better around it, get different around it? Can we do already now test, and we'll come to this one, a new business model? Can we test already something? Can we connect differently with our customers or consumers at the moment? Can we do something so that we already are right here in the start, to not get into paralysis here? And this is what I would recommend every crisis leader to have this dual strategy on the circle of influence, where you, of course, fix the crisis. The higher the crisis mode that you have, the more, but that you also include more and more the long-term fixation, so that you actually see as much as you can see where you can navigate out of this. Then, number 3, we'll come to the crisis leadership style. And before I get into this, I would love to have your opinion on one field. And that is one thing. I would love to explore, what would you say is the biggest mistakes that you've seen crisis leaders do? What are the biggest mistakes that you have seen crisis leaders do? And again, this is a selective list. That doesn't mean I just added all of the above, none of the above. Maybe it's other areas and so on that you see, and other mistakes and so on that you've seen. But I would love to get a bit of a feeling for what are some of the key mistakes that you see. And just to repeat, what do I see very, very often? They're not acting fast enough, facing reality and then jumping into that window of opportunity, not acknowledging the crisis. No empathy towards the organization, not inspiring confidence, or all of the above, none of the above. Let's look at what you see at the moment here. And we see quite a distribution with the highest at the moment, all of the above, so to speak. So these are some of the mistakes, and probably the individuals projecting this at the moment don't probably came up in your question of who's the best crisis leader that you've seen. But especially here on number 2, what comes up again, and we'll dive into this one, is also not inspiring confidence came up as number 2. But also we see a broad distribution here in these different areas. And we'll dive into some of the topics here as well. So let's talk and let's explore the crisis leadership style. Crisis leadership style. And for that, I typically look at, and I've been researching about leadership for the past 15 years, and it's interesting if we see like the different classifications of leadership styles. Typically, what is one that is accepted and so on is the idea of 4 different leadership styles. And that doesn't mean one has to have one, but it's like the different tendencies that one have. Directional leadership, transactional leadership, transformational leadership, and empowering leadership. Directional leadership is, I tell you what to do and by when. Transactional leadership is, I set up a couple of incentives so that you do more of this, typically in sales, or less of something. Transformational leadership is that big vision for change for the world, sometimes also called the Steve Jobs type of leadership. And empowering leadership is, well, that's in the word, empower the organization to do the job. Now, my question for you for self-reflection is, in crisis, I've been talking about this in all 4 leadership styles a lot, but in crisis, what would you say for yourself? Just make the reflection as well. What is one of the most powerful leadership styles that there is? Think it and reflect it for yourself. And I'll get to this one later, because in innovation and in change and digital transformation, we talk a lot about transformational and empowering leadership style, that these are the ones that really help drive innovation. And what is empowering leadership style? Well, you let the team and so on decide. Now, in times of crisis, though, I think leaders have to be very, very flexible. And my favorite example for this one is always the fire truck. While I'm a huge fan of empowering leadership in the right situation, I think in times of crisis, leaders need to switch and need to take charge. Why is the fire truck my favorite example? Because like if the fire truck runs and comes to the fire, and there's a fire burning and the team gets out, the fire team, and then one person comes like, okay, so where do we start? Let's explore where we could start. Let's see what the best thing is. And you see, that would immediately get confusion. So in the times of crisis, when the house is burning, I think it's enormously important that the leader sets the task and says, here, here, and here. We come later as well, of course, with involvement in the team, but the stepping up of leadership in times of crisis is enormously important. And I had this discussion once, unfortunately, we had here in Brussels, also 4 years ago, quite some heavy attacks here as well. And I was reflecting with an organization later on about their leadership from it. And one person was extremely good in bringing everybody in and empowering leadership style. But what the organization later on saw, as well as the leader, is like, well, at that moment of these horrible attacks, everybody expected, even if everybody expected empowering before and having worked, everybody expected that that person steps up and says, what is the direction? And I think that is something that we all have to learn after years of trying to empower the organization in times of crisis. We need to step up and we need to first set direction. And that really brings me to part B, setting the direction. And that is strategy number 4 then. Once we've accepted reality and faced reality, and once we've determined that we need to act fast and so on, then one of the things that we do and can do and need to do is to bend reality, to really see where do we go in this. Now, John Maxwell once said, a leader is someone who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. I liked how you punchy phrased that. Now, personally, especially in this day and age, I would agree with 2/3 of the statement, because knows the way at the moment would be a very bold statement, like what is the right way? But goes the way together with the team and the organization and helps try to show the way together with the team is a key thing. Now, the way at the moment for lots of you who are trying to lead, who are trying to navigate through that situation, looks a little bit like this. So the question is, of course, what is the right way? And then I see that right now when I look at, when I interview leaders, when I discuss with them through them, when I help them and I coach leadership teams, people go like, yeah, we have now a plan. And sometimes I call that also this. Okay, now we're back in control. We have a plan, and we've put the PowerPoint presentation together for this, and here's what it looks like. And sometimes the confusion then gets even more in place. Like, wow, no, we're back to the old. We're back into PowerPoint. Like nobody knows. And there's like, yeah, but put together a plan. Just today, I read in the news here in local European on one airline who needs to get solved, who's requesting support funding. And one of the things people said, like, yeah, look, we're putting together the action plan until 2022, until 2022. I was like, wow. I mean, 3 months ago, nobody was expecting here in these ways any there. How can you now go back into planning all that? However, having said that, of course, some direction is important. And I think one tool that should be in every crisis leader's toolbox is something I would call the commander's intent. And that is inspired, of course, also by the military, who has also seen that lots of commands and directions got with PowerPoints and more complex situations, like very, very broad, so that some branches of the military actually resulted back in saying, like, look, at the beginning of every command, there should be a quick direction. And that's got the commander's intent. Of course, in more military terms, like, if we do nothing else during tomorrow's mission, we must, and then complete the blanks. The single most important thing that we must do tomorrow is completing the blanks. Now, our view as crisis leaders looks a little bit different, but what it would push every crisis leader to know and to communicate well is to be, what is it that we and the organization need to focus on now? So that clarity there comes in place. And reflect maybe 20 seconds for, in your circle of influence, for your organization, for your project, for your team, whatever it is that you are leading, what is the single most important thing that we must focus on now? And fill in that blank. Number 5, communicate often and openly. Often and openly. And that is now that we have identified where's the direction that we go, now comes the key thing. And very often I see leadership taking a step back saying, like, yeah, we did the update and everybody's clear and everybody's fine. No, they're not. No, people are maybe not. There is a sweet spot of communication. And I very often try to see that, what is the confusion level in the organization and what is the information level in the organization. If there's too much or too little, well, you have high confusion. What crisis leaders step into is see, like, what is the sweet spot of the right communication. What does not help is the 100-page PowerPoint deck that has been then put together all the time, like, here's the crisis plan, because people are still like, well, I don't have time to work. But what also doesn't help is like, okay, go ahead. Do whatever. No, let's go to the direction. Some direction is very clear, and it should be short and concise, taking that commander's intent and maybe putting it a bit more together. So what I like in very often is that often and openly communicating that types of ideas and so on. And I've seen the greatest crisis leaders very often, when they do their quick updates, they do and acknowledge this. They face reality. The situation is tough. The situation is very hard. Again, depending on your company, your organization, your team. Here's what we do know about it at the moment. I'm not talking about the general realm, but in our circle of influence and so on. Here's what we do know. And then, most important, here's what we don't know. And I'll come to this one later in a second. But what I see very often is that people think, like, no, I need to be in control of everything. Well, we've seen how far that took us here at the moment. At the moment, it's extremely important to understand, what do we know? What do we don't know? Acknowledge this. Saying maybe what are the steps that we take to explore more. But here's what we don't know so far. And based on what we know and what we don't know, this is what we focus on, the single most important things that we have to do right now. And then acknowledging, we'll come to this also later, we know this is very hard for you. And some of you going through very tough crises, this is, of course, extremely hard. On the families, on the individuals, and everybody. Acknowledging that and seeing that, not taking that for granted. We know this is very hard on you, very hard for many of you to go through this one. We'll continue to update you and really giving a plan of where do we continue to update. That type of communication, not understanding like, hey, I need to have all the answers. Of course, that would be great, but sometimes situations really evolve very, very quickly. But what is important is to take the step back and really giving that kind of direction. Now, I put here, what do we know, what do we don't know, like the knowledge level as well as the confidence level that we have on this side, confident, not confident, so to speak. And where the crisis leaders' key playing field is, I would say, is here in this full field. Always, of course, with confidence, and we'll come to this one also later on, with confidence, I'm clearing like, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is what we've decided what we do. Because that is, in times of crisis, what people want to hear, and actually maybe also like what needs to be communicated. What is not so great, really saying like, well, yeah, here's what we know, but we really don't know how to move here forward and so on, which doesn't mean you don't have to integrate. We'll come to this one also later on. But the key thing is like with confidence saying like what we don't know and seeing like how will we fill these white spots, so to speak, in our knowledge map. How do we try to navigate that further? And also with confidence saying like, here's what we do know and sharing that. Because very often in crisis, of course, we know that the organization is in confusion, doesn't really know like, okay, where's that going through? What do we do differently? How do we best get out of this one? So with confidence exploring and sharing what we know and also what we don't know. Because that also gives them the confidence. If people then have the process of, if people at least know the process of how do they know more information, then we get also more clarity. So we have the fundamentals, then we have the setting direction, and now it's also to get creative. Because we are in a situation that probably not a lot of people have been here before. It is a novel situation. We're in uncharted waters, as we so often say. And the question is, how do we best navigate this? Strategy number 6 for this one is explore. And I like to use that framework because I think crisis leaders now at this stage need to step out of a certain framework. If we look at the environment, I like it that we can separate it somewhere in a static environment and a dynamic environment. Static environment is maybe that what you have, maybe at the time it seemed to be very, very dynamic, but probably what we had back in January, December, and so on, a couple of months ago, that was a static environment, and we had long operating history there. Short operating history is like where we don't know really like how to navigate this, and dynamic environment is very fast developing. For sure, we can say we're in such an area here at the moment, I think across the globe. Now, what we all used to, of course, is long operating history, static environment to predict and plan for someone, for some areas. But what do we do in the other field? And for this, I want to share with you what we do here. For this, I want to ask you 2 quick questions just to illustrate that a little bit further. For very, very important now, and I trust you all over the globe that you won't do it. Don't Google Bing or whatever your answer there. I want to share with you 2 answers from Nobel Prize winning research. 2 quick questions. And I would love to get your answers from this. Don't Google the answers. Just like the first thing that comes to mind, click on the poll. And you will see in a second what that has in mind. So, is the total population of Bangladesh greater than 35 million, yes or no? Just do a quick answer. Okay, and you will see in a second what that has to do with crisis leadership. Okay, results are coming in. Okay, we'll broadcast the results. Roughly 2/3 of you say, yep, it's bigger. 1/3 says, no, it's not bigger. Question number 2 now. Question number 2. This is a follow-up question for this. Please give now your estimate of the total population of Bangladesh. And I've given you a couple of brackets here. What is now your estimate? And again, without Googling all of this one, what is your estimate for it? Okay, and results are coming in. And again, this is not a question for geography reasons. Just like go with the first thing that comes to mind. Okay, fantastic. I will broadcast the results. And you can see some of you said between 0 and 5. I think the majorities are between 50 and 30, 30 and 45, 45 and 75 has actually, these are the biggest areas, and then some outliers there also in the large ones. Now, Why have I shared that with you? The average outcome, now it's gone on the vote, but the average outcome was probably somewhere where you click was probably somewhere around 65 and so on. We had the largest bracket between 35 and 50 and so on. And what is the most important here? Here we can see that now again. Basically, the largest bracket 30 to 45 and 15 to 30. Now, what is most important here? Why have I shared this question? Very much so, you were like, if we rewind back, I will move that back. If you rewind back, okay, to this point, and you ask like, okay, now 2 questions will come from last. 2 questions come on. Is the total population from Bangladesh greater than 35? This is a question from Nobel Prize winning research from Daniel Kahneman and Adam Tversky. That has been tested across the globe as well. And I looked at it also with our audience present as well. That maybe not the geography that is being asked with most present. Probably you've asked yourself like, oh, what does that have to do with crisis leadership? The really interesting question came with question number 2. Please give an estimate of the total population of Bangladesh. And there probably you say like, well, how would I know? Maybe I Google it or maybe not, and so on. But probably then the real interesting thing comes, and I can see that also here in the question here. What has happened is probably something that came to mind is that some of you thought like, I have no idea, but it's not 35. I answered bigger, so probably I should stay consistent with that. But it's a bit bigger. It's maybe 50, or maybe it's twice that. Maybe it's a 70. I click on that to 70 bucket, or maybe it's something different. But the vast majority of you, and we saw the results here as well, stayed within roughly that bracket of the 35. And that is one of the most tested biases in the research of Kahneman that we come across, which is called the anchoring bias. Indeed, like one of you also mentioned there in the question. The anchoring bias, the 35 anchored your answer. And this has been validated across the board. It has been also validated around here. By the way, the real answer is around about 166 million, in case you have Googled that already right now. So we were a little bit off, but that was not a geography test here. This much rather shows one of the key things that leaders fall into place. Because also in our day-to-day life, we are anchored. All of you might have seen anchoring in real life already. If you go back, for example, if you've ever done a back-on-the-envelope calculation on a project, and you said, oh, probably that's $500,000 for this. And then somebody walked by from maybe senior leadership team and says, oh, so what are you working on? A project. Okay, so what's the budget? I don't know, I'm just 10 minutes here. It's like, yeah, but just give me a number. Come on, just a number. The number you say then for the rest of the project life will be the number that you will be asked to reconcile against. What? 750, but you said 500. Yeah, but that was in the beginning after 10 minutes. Yeah, but well, what's the difference between that? But we also see that in leadership. Because very often people go back to the strategies and the practices they know and they have experienced in their first leadership life. Now, we just have a problem. Nobody, probably on this call, has ever managed a pandemic. And nobody has been, probably the 2008 is maybe for those of you who navigated through it, but also there, basically the similarities are, there are some similarities, but also strong differences. So how do we deal with that best? Well, maybe we need to throw out some of our anchoring, and really now it's time to leverage that and to really test out a couple of new things. And how do we do that best? With something that I call the spaghetti principle. I'm a big fan of the spaghetti principle. Therefore, we have also an international audience here over there. There are basically 4 methods in the world, and I do that with international audiences. There are 4 methods in the world on how you can say that spaghetti are ready to eat when you cook them. For those of you who cook, or for those of you who have ever watched while others are cooking, how do you know if spaghetti are ready to eat? And there are the 4 methods, and we see that here. Okay, results are coming in now as well. Okay, look at this. So in Broska's result, the vast majority say, I taste them and see if they are al dente and so on. But there's also like 15% of you who go, I time them, it says 10 minutes, and after 10 minutes I eat them, basically. I look at them. These are the gourmet experts who just know they're ready. But there's also, we throw them at the wall or the fridge or the ceiling and see if they stick. And I know this is in some cultures, there are some people say like, you can't do that. That is then over ready. But I don't want to go into that. But I think it's especially that last one. Throw them at the wall and see if they stick, which you can try at home. It works really, is a very, very nice strategy, but I use that as a metaphor to deal, especially in this environment here. If we go back to our crisis overshoot here, where we can do in this dynamic environment, short operating history, this is what we have to do, is to throw stuff to the wall and see if it sticks. Forecasting, saying like, oh yeah, I know what's going to work here. Nobody knows it at the moment. But where crisis leaders now have to dive in is to have lots of little experiments of what does work, what doesn't work. We need to really test it out. Lots of us have been thrown into remote working environments. Well, also these can be now testing it out, testing out what works, testing out things like Mural, which is a fantastic tool for collaboration as well. Why not test it out? Remote drawing, for example, like I do. Why not test it out? New business models, maybe. We see lots of restaurants getting very creative in their business model. Try them out and test it out. At the moment, I know lots of you are in deep crisis at the moment, but it's also the moment where we have to don't get anchored to things that worked in the past, but really throw things at the wall, see if they stick. And if they stick, continue to do them so that we can navigate further. If they don't stick, well, then we test out something else. That is, I would say, the more or less the key thing that a crisis leader can do, like a selected experiments at the moment where we throw things at the wall and see if they stick, rather than forecasting and knowing exactly what will happen in 2022, because nobody knows that at the moment. If you want to learn, by the way, more about this, I've put together a couple of book strategies in a word like innovation that sticks, because it sticks to the wall with that spaghetti principle here. So that just came out. Strategy number 7. Involve the full organization where then possible. We talked about the direction setting before, and I fundamentally believe in a crisis. There I am again. My apologies that this happens. Somehow the connection here does not seem to be ideal. Apologies again. I hope we don't have another area. So thanks a lot for waiting, maybe for reflecting as well, how to involve the organization where it is possible. Now, how do we involve? We know it's easy, right? You meet with some people, you communicate then to the team, and then you implement and you're happy, and that's it. No, of course, we don't know. We all know it's not that easy and so on. It doesn't work like this in a crisis setting. It's much more that people update and communicate, and sometimes it looks a little bit more like this. People are like, what are they doing there and again? Like, what is happening here? And have you heard this as well? That is what is very often happening. Now, what we can do is involve others much more. And one of the key things that we can do, once we've given the direction, and I think once we've stepped forward as a leader, is to say, okay, so now here's the direction, but now team, we are in this together, so to speak. So let's explore it as much as possible, so to speak. What could we do? And then for a team, asking like one step further on this one, what could we do? And then especially should be in every crisis leader's toolbox, because then people might share something. All right, great. And then ask the Nespresso question. Some of you might know Nespresso, the global advertising of Nespresso with George Clooney. Then they're saying, Nespresso, what else? And I think that what else question can be a very powerful one. What could we do? Okay, great. That's one answer. What else could we do? Because not pretending like, quick, we have first answers, but what else? What else? What else? And by that, actually, the leader goes into the process leadership mode, not just in the reactive type of mode. It's like, what else? Let's explore. Working together with the team to explore new areas. And for example, one team that I know that has seen that was a TEDx organizing team, actually, for a TEDx conference. Yeah, they were organizing a conference with 1,200 people, which unfortunately, of course, got canceled at the moment and got postponed. But they got together and said, like, we still want to do something with the speakers. And they used exactly that methodology because we worked there on that. And they came up with new areas that they haven't explored there before. Okay, what else could we do to connect in crisis? Well, maybe we do coffee with speakers with mini TEDx talks via this coffee chat. And that's what this TEDx Luxembourg team has now implemented as well. So it's exploring what else. But also, one of the things that I can highly, highly recommend in times of crisis, because there, when emotions are high, emotions up, what can happen there very often is like that people get heated, or some people also draw themselves back and have difficulty sharing as well. what is a very powerful tool, instead of discussing everything, is brain writing. So instead of brainstorming, we do brain writing. So what is brain writing? Well, if you say like, okay, let's face how we can go about this. Everybody writes before something is anchored, before some direction is given, everybody writes down their key ideas. And then, without having it anchored before, basically you see the breadth of possibilities. So also that can help you get creative in a crisis very fast, and actually works also very, very nice in a virtual setting, like we discussed in the last session with Mural and other areas. Number 8, show empathy and care. Show empathy and care. And that is, I think, one of the things, whenever I work with organizations, I sometimes see like, well, of course, lots of companies especially look, how can we, well, some of them even, how can we survive this crisis? How can we navigate this crisis forward? But what is sometimes missing then is really to see with the team, with the organization, what are they going through? That is also quite some hardships and so on. That is not just about the numbers and how to save the company, but it's actually acknowledging just the hardships. And just this morning, I saw one example for this. And of course, unfortunately, we see across the world now quite some impact, and start seeing on a lot of companies now quite some impact. One of them being Airbnb. But what Brian Chesky, the CEO there, says, like, and it's very, very hard. I mean, some of you might have seen Airbnb, that's 25% of their individuals go. But one of the communication actually here shows, at least in all our hardship that it is and so on, but in the phrase of communication is one example that shows at least empathy towards it. To those leaving, I'm truly sorry. This is not your fault. The world never stops seeking the qualities and talents that you brought to Airbnb. And that was in part of the departure message, which is, of course, never an easy message. And for every individual who receives that, a very, very tough situation. But at least it is not communicated like, okay, here you go, and so on. But it's really like putting these action in place. Where sometimes in other crisis moments, you can still hear again like, well, get your act together. That is it. Move forward. And I see sometimes some managers who have the attitude like, well, we need to move through this. And, you know, if I haven't complained, you can think of yourself as having been praised in this crisis. Now, that we can obviously assume is not a good strategy and not a good way forward. So what is one tool that I use? Try to think of yourself, even get metrics around it. Get the praise to criticism ratio from 2 to 1. 2 praises for 1 criticism. 2 praises for 1 criticism. And especially one thing, and I think that is a crisis leadership key task, catch people doing something right. Catch people where you think they are doing something right. Because very often, you know, in times of uncertainty, we don't know what's right or wrong from a perspective of the lead. What the leader's role can be there is at least like when you see like, hey, okay, that was a good initiative here. Tell people that. Don't assume like, okay, they might know because they've proposed it. We're all navigating uncharted waters. And one of the key roles of the crisis leader is like catch people doing something right. Now we come to the next part and the last part, which is also, I think, a key focus area for the crisis leader, which is to lead yourself. And I think fundamentally, great leadership starts with self-leadership. Great leadership starts with self-leadership. Now, what is one of the key things here? It is self-control. Self-control is one of the first things that one starts here. And why do we need self-control? Well, because we don't want to run around like that headless chicken here, like that headless chicken. How do we get self-control? Well, certainly not by staying down and calming down, basically by saying like, okay, stay calm, telling yourself stay calm or telling to others stay calm. Because very often we want to be like that and we want to say like, it is different here. But if you tell somebody to stay calm, I think this here is very true. Nobody in the history of calming down has ever calmed down by being told to calm down by others. And I think that is very true in a crisis as well. Now, what is one quick strategy here that can help for self-control whenever that happens is something, again, to learn from people in high-stress situations. And one strategy that I came across once is what is called warrior breathing. What is warrior breathing? It's basically a 4-4-4-4. It's a very quick strategy, but especially in high-stress situation, to calm yourself down again. 4 times inhaling, breathe, count of 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, holding it for 4 counts, releasing it for 4 counts, holding it for 4 counts. Might seem very like, oh, what does that have to do with self-leadership and self-control? But actually going into this and really managing and working on this one can be a very, very powerful thing. Another self-control strategy that I very often use is on a scale from 1 to 10. On a scale from 1 to 10, how important is the answer that I give right now? Before one answers was in a high stress situation, on a scale from 1 to 10. And then making that little side note mark there. Number 10 is self-reflection. And this almost goes towards the next strategy, basically beyond the crisis. It's also taking a step back every day, every evening maybe as well, and do a little self-reflection, like as a crisis leader, what am I going through at the moment? What are the tough things at the moment? Doing a self-reflection exercise. And then taking that step back and maybe reflecting, okay, on a scale from 1 to 10, how good a crisis leader was I here today? But also maybe doing another crisis leadership exercise. When this is over, and one of the things that in terms of crisis leadership I always keep for myself in mind, like also this too shall pass. Also this shall pass, basically, as things have passed in history as well. This too shall pass. But what have I learned then from this? What would I have wished I would have done differently at the beginning? Because very often we have something which I would call the vapor trail effect in life. When we come out of a crisis or certain situations, it's like, I mean, we don't see that many airplanes at the moment, but it's like at the beginning of that vapor trail here. It's very clear and concise. And it's like, oh, if that happens again, I would do everything differently. But after a couple of months, and hopefully we will, again, this too shall pass, this crisis will go over. Hopefully then it will go over, but then very often that focus as well goes a little bit away. Think what I recommend leaders to do, crisis leaders to do, think about one thing. For all of you going through the crisis leadership at the moment, think about what would you have wished you would have done differently, maybe in March, maybe in February, maybe in January. What was one thing how you maybe or your company would have been differently prepared? What is one thing where you think like, I should have done this differently? Take maybe 15 seconds right now and write this down to one statement, just for yourself. What was one thing that you recommend you would have been differently prepared, would have thought differently, and so on? Just do that self-reflection for a second. And if you've done that, what I recommend you to do after the session is to put this in, let's say, 1 year or 2 years from now in your calendar, and really remind yourself that you really have done that to avoid that vapor trail effect that I sometimes talk about, because that is then learning, and hopefully when we overcome this crisis as well, for the next crisis, and that's how the crisis leader also grows then forward. So there we go. These were 10 strategies that we've looked at: facing reality, accepting the reality, defining circles of influence, defining the crisis leadership style, which is also, especially in the moment of the crisis, directive leadership, from then taking a step back, setting direction, commander's intent. What we need to do right now is listen to this. Often in open communications, in that sweet spot of not too long, not too short, with these areas that we do, what we do know, what we don't know. Explore new ideas with the spaghetti principle and throw things to the wall, because we don't know what works well, but that's why we have to step out of the anchoring as well. Engage the whole organization. What else? What else? Bring them into these ideas once the direction is clear. Showing empathy as well, because situations are tough, and it's the leader's role also to show empathy, practice self-control, and practice as well self-reflection. And what I would love you to do right now is maybe to reflect on this one, and I want to open up an open question here as well for you. Now, you've thought about the best crisis leader. You've heard about some of the things that we've heard here, the 10 strategies and so on that I shared with. What I would love you to do is maybe share a couple of areas of what would you now expect in 5 words from a good crisis leader, maybe from that individual and so on that you've seen there. Maybe if you can start to type in and just share a couple of areas here, so that maybe you create your own 5-word summary from our session, from your reflection of good crisis leadership and others. All right, and results are coming in while you're typing. Okay. Good, and I'll open up the broadcast results. I'll see that here, and we see that, again, define reality, transparent communication. We see that here, good communicator, respect, showing the empathy and transparency, honesty that we see here. Remember the human element in the crisis, inspiring confidence, focus on calmness, calm, guiding, encouraging, as well, showing the vulnerability and open what one doesn't know, and so on. Okay, walk the talk. Everybody's watching. Absolutely. And we see lots of areas here coming in that we see that here. Direction, openness, self-control, and engagement. I hope you've created your own summary for this for this year. I will end this poll right now. It's a great your own summary. Before I go, I have one more strategy as well that I wanted to share with you. But I see just a question that is coming in. How do you address a leader that just doesn't want to hear it? How do you address a leader that doesn't want to hear it? So if I understand the question correctly, if you are, so to speak, reporting somebody who is just not walking all of this, it's a very difficult situation, very difficult scenario as well. How do you address a leader who doesn't want to hear maybe reality as well? A couple of things that one can do, of course, especially when it gets very, very crisis ridden, so to speak, the situation is really addressing this, trying to form maybe a coalition with other colleagues and have a joint statement, so to speak, forward towards the leader. Maybe also seeing like, okay, is there maybe, again, depending on the severity of the situation for you, but are there other people similar to the leader, some allies and so on that you can bring in to really talk sense maybe into the leader as well, if you have this, if there's some other people who can talk this. Very often, if somebody just doesn't want to face reality, it is a very, very difficult thing. I see another question here. What about a bully leader who pushes their agenda? Yeah, again, a very, very tough situation. And unfortunately, the crisis, as we all know, brings on sometimes the best of people as well as the worst of people. And especially when the lack of self-control is there, very often people go into this head in the sand mentality and say like, okay, just ignore reality like this Jenga tower and just go ahead with my agenda and that's it. Very tough one, of course, if one is in that scenario. But at one stage, I think it is an important thing, how do you address a bully to literally stand up, work maybe as well with the HR department in this stage, but really like trying to, again, form a coalition, so to speak, also with others, so really saying like, no, we need to stand up, we need to address that here. That is not going to the right thing. So, but this is always easy to say from the chair without knowing, of course, that individual there as well. But the key thing is, at one stage, if you see, well, the course of that team, of that company is going in the wrong direction, maybe we need to address that here differently. Then it is one task like what I've done in the past, really like sum up my thoughts, stand it up, and really say like also send it up to so to speak people beyond the leader itself and say like, this cannot go on like this. We have to step up and we have to change course here, and this is my position. At one stage, if it's such a bully leadership, so to speak, like this standing up and saying like, okay, what is the course of action and so on, and what is my position here? Taking a step back, not addressing that person, but maybe writing that down, one's position, like the key principles and so on, is one strategy, and maybe then even distributing that forward. Again, always depending on the situation there. We're coming to the end of our session here. The one thing that I have learned as well for me, like the result of my self-reflection exercise, was actually to think and reflect more of the FIRE principle. And I've been teaching one, we've been talking about this for more than 5 years, but actually it came now, especially with this crisis, so important here back in place. And that for my reflection exercise, that's what I've put in place here. And what is the FIRE principle? Well, fires can be extinguished still relatively easy when the fire is still small. When it starts burning, it gets difficult. So that's why as a leader, even if it's unpopular, stepping in very early on is a key thing to prevent maybe one crisis. And to keep that always in mind for maybe future crises is one thing that I've learned forward. If you have any further questions, and again, sorry for the mishap, sorry for the 2 disconnections, that is really, really unfortunate. It's unfortunate we have like maybe a lot of overload here as well. Apologies for that again, for that hiccup. If you have any further questions, send them over here. There's also part 3 coming up next week on now how we deal with the crisis, but then how can we think ahead in the new world? And we want to really interactively explore that together with you. That brings us to the very end of the crisis, not of the crisis, of the webcast as well. Hopefully, unfortunately, not yet for the crisis, but hopefully very soon for the this crisis, we will see some kind of end of the light of the tunnel. But what would be great as well is to hear your thoughts again about this. I wish you all the best, and I know some of you are going through very, very tough situations. All the best for this, all the courage and so on for that. Hope to see you next week as well to the part 3 of the series. Hope to hear your feedback. And again, sorry that we have these 2 hiccups, but also this happens in new scenarios where we connect from home and so on in this one. So have a great rest of the day. Looking forward to seeing you again next week.